September 14, 1943. The village of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, England, hummed with an unusual energy as evening descended over the cobblestone streets and centuries-old stone buildings. Outside the local parish hall, a line of young women in their finest dresses waited eagerly for the weekly dance that had become a cherished ritual, their laughter carrying across the quiet village square where generations of residents had gathered for festivals and celebrations. Inside the hall, the band members tuned their instruments with practiced precision, preparing for another night of entertainment that had become a precious escape from the grinding weight of a war now entering its fifth exhausting year. The smell of floor wax mixed with the faint scent of the women's carefully hoarded perfume, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and carefully preserved normalcy. What none of them knew, as they straightened their dresses and checked their hair in compact mirrors, was that this ordinary Saturday evening was about to become a defining moment in the quiet battle against prejudice being fought far from any battlefield, a battle waged not with weapons but with simple human dignity and moral courage. The American military commanders organizing the event believed they had solved a potential problem with careful planning, clear regulations, and the kind of bureaucratic precision that the United States military prided itself on implementing. They had scheduled the dance, arranged for the band, ensured adequate security, and most importantly, established clear attendance guidelines that would prevent what they viewed as inappropriate mixing. They were about to discover how profoundly they had misunderstood the people they were meant to be defending, and how little power military regulations held when confronted with civilian moral conviction. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a group of British women transformed an act of discrimination into a powerful statement of human dignity, how their simple act of solidarity rewrote the rules of an entire military establishment, and how one evening in a small English village demonstrated that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than moral clarity and collective will, could successfully challenge institutional injustice. The build-up to this moment had begun months earlier, in the spring of 1943, when the United States Army's 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion arrived in Bamber Bridge after a long Atlantic crossing aboard crowded transport ships. The unit, composed entirely of black soldiers, led predominantly by white officers following the standard segregation policy of the American military, had been tasked with critical construction work supporting the Allied air campaign that was systematically destroying industrial targets across occupied Europe. For the residents of this small Lancashire village of fewer than 4,000 souls, nestled among the gentle hills and working-class textile mills of northern England, the arrival of several hundred American servicemen represented the most dramatic change their community had experienced in generations, perhaps since the coming of the railways in the previous century. Private James Wilson, a 22-year-old from the south side of Chicago, Illinois, where he had worked in a meatpacking plant before the war, remembered his first impression of Bamber Bridge with the kind of vivid clarity that marks genuinely transformative experiences. Standing on the platform of the local railway station on a cool April morning, his olive-drab duffel bag slung over his shoulder and his boots still carrying the grime of the long journey from the port, he had braced himself for the kind of reception he knew intimately from back home. The suspicious glances, the careful maintenance of physical distance, the subtle and not-so-subtle messages that his presence was tolerated at best, unwelcome at worst. What he encountered instead left him momentarily speechless, unable to process information that contradicted everything his life experience had taught him to expect. An elderly woman, her grey hair carefully pinned beneath a simple hat and her coat showing the careful mending that marked wartime Britain's make-do-and-mend culture, approached him directly without hesitation or the slight backward step that white Americans invariably took when approaching black strangers. She smiled warmly, genuine friendliness crinkling the corners of her eyes, and asked in her thick Lancashire accent if he needed directions to his billet, or if he would like to know where he might find a good cup of tea. She spoke to him with the same easy courtesy she would show anyone else, no guardedness in her posture, no calculation in her eyes about appropriate social distance, just simple human kindness offered to a tired soldier far from home. For Wilson and his fellow soldiers, this was a revelation that bordered on the surreal. Their fundamental challenge to assumptions so deeply embedded, they had seemed like natural laws rather than social constructions. Technical Sergeant Robert Matthews, a 30-year-old veteran from rural Alabama who had picked cotton as a child before the military offered an escape from grinding poverty, had served in the United States Army for 6 years. In that time, through postings from Georgia to Texas to California, he had grown accustomed to the rigid segregation that governed every aspect of military life, with the force of federal regulation and local custom. Separate barracks that were inevitably older and more poorly maintained than those assigned to white units. Separate mess halls where the food somehow never quite matched the quality served elsewhere. Separate recreational facilities that were always smaller, more crowded, less well-equipped. The unwritten but universally understood rule that black soldiers should make themselves invisible when white soldiers were present, should step off sidewalks, should lower their voices, should constantly signal their acceptance of subordinate status through 1,000 tiny acts of deference. The constant awareness that one misstep, one perceived act of disrespect or presumption, one moment of forgetting one's place, could result in consequences ranging from informal punishment to formal charges, to violence that the military police would investigate with notable lack of enthusiasm. Matthews had developed the careful awareness that all black men in America learned to cultivate, the ability to read white faces for signs of brewing anger, to calculate the safest response to any situation, to make himself smaller and less threatening through posture and demeanor and careful word choice. England operated under fundamentally different assumptions, and the contrast could not have been more stark or more unsettling to men conditioned to constant vigilance. The British government, facing the existential reality of total war, and desperate for every possible source of support, in a conflict that had already cost hundreds of thousands of British lives, had made it diplomatically clear that American segregation practices would not be officially enforced on British soil. More importantly, the ordinary people of places like Bamber Bridge simply could not comprehend the American obsession with racial separation, could not understand the elaborate social machinery required to maintain it, and saw no reason why they should participate in importing such obviously peculiar foreign customs to their own communities. The local pub owners, practical men who had served beer to working-class drinkers of all descriptions for decades, saw no reason why they should bar any servicemen from their establishments when all servicemen had money to spend and the war had created acute labor shortages that made every customer valuable. The shopkeepers struggling with rationing and supply difficulties were happy to serve any customer with money and ration coupons, seeing no logic in turning away anyone willing to queue patiently and pay the asking price. The young women of the village, many with sweethearts or brothers or fathers serving overseas in North Africa or Italy, or preparing for the still-secret invasion of France, saw the American soldiers as allies and potential friends, fellow young people caught up in a conflict none of them had chosen, not as members of groups that should be kept rigidly apart, based on criteria that seemed meaningless in the context of shared sacrifice. This collision between American prejudice and British pragmatism, between elaborate American racial ideology and British working-class common sense, created a situation that military planners had not anticipated in their careful preparations and did not know how to manage without creating diplomatic incidents or appearing foolish. The United States Army had prepared detailed regulations covering everything from uniform standards to leave procedures to the proper handling of military mail. But they had not prepared adequate guidance for what to do when the civilian population of an allied nation simply refused to recognize the racial categories that American military culture considered fundamental to proper order and discipline. Corporal Thomas Henderson, a sharp-minded 24-year-old from Harlem in New York City, who had completed 2 years of college before the war and served as company clerk due to his typing skills and careful penmanship, kept detailed personal notes throughout his time in England. His observations, written in small notebooks purchased from local shops and carefully preserved through years of moves and postings, captured the growing tension between official military policy and social reality with the keen eye of someone trained to notice discrepancies in paperwork and regulations. He wrote of how white American military police, conditioned by years of enforcing segregation in the American South and on military bases across the country, would attempt to impose racial separation in British pubs, only to be told firmly by British landlords that all soldiers were welcome or none were, that they ran their establishments according to British law and British custom, and that they would not be dictated to by foreigners about whom they could or could not serve. He described the visible confusion of white American officers who expected British civilians to respect the racial hierarchy they considered as natural and inevitable as the rotation of the seasons, only to find themselves gently but firmly contradicted at every turn by British civilians who simply did not share their assumptions. He recorded conversations with British workers who asked, with genuine bewilderment, why the American army kept its soldiers separated by skin color when they were all fighting the same enemy and facing the same dangers. He noted the way British children, untutored in American racial etiquette, would approach black soldiers with the same curiosity and friendliness they showed any exotic visitors to their small village. The American military command faced a genuine dilemma that challenged their organizational assumptions and diplomatic skills. They could not officially impose segregation in British civilian spaces without creating a diplomatic incident that would embarrass the American government and offend their hosts at a time when Allied cooperation was absolutely essential to military success. The British government, while willing to accommodate many American requests and requirements, had made it clear that they would not enforce American racial policies on British soil. British public opinion, already skeptical of many American cultural practices and increasingly critical of American racial policies as the war progressed, would not tolerate obvious discrimination against soldiers who were, after all, contributing to the defense of Britain. But the American command also felt intense pressure from white soldiers and officers who considered racial mixing to be intolerable, who had been raised in a culture that taught them segregation was not merely policy but moral necessity, who genuinely believed that allowing social equality between black and white soldiers would undermine military discipline and cohesion. Many white Southern officers in particular saw segregation as essential to maintaining what they considered proper order, and they pressured their superiors to find some way to maintain racial separation, even in the challenging environment of wartime Britain. The solution they arrived at, after considerable discussion and negotiation, was to create separate recreational facilities for black and white troops, scheduling events at different times and in different locations so that the two groups would rarely, if ever, encounter each other in social settings. They would maintain segregation through careful logistical separation rather than through explicit prohibition that might offend British sensibilities. Dances for white troops would be held on different evenings than dances for black troops. Recreational facilities would be assigned to different units on a schedule that ensured minimal contact. Leave periods would be staggered so that soldiers from different racial groups would be in different places at different times. This arrangement satisfied no one but allowed all parties to avoid direct confrontation over principles that both sides considered fundamental. Black soldiers had access to recreational activities and some freedom to move about in British communities, even if those activities were carefully timed and circumscribed to prevent contact with white units. British civilians could welcome American soldiers into their shops and pubs and social events without having to choose between them or participate directly in enforcing American racial policies. White soldiers and officers could maintain their preferred social distance without having to explain their reasoning to bewildered and increasingly critical British hosts who found the entire arrangement both bizarre and morally questionable. Into this delicate balance maintained through bureaucratic maneuvering and careful scheduling came the announcement of the dance at Bamber Bridge Parish Hall on the evening of September 14th. The event had been organized by the United States Army Special Services Division, the branch responsible for maintaining morale and providing recreational activities for troops, which operated under the principle that happy soldiers were more effective soldiers. The official notice, posted on bulletin boards throughout the American military installations scattered around the Lancashire countryside, specified in clear and unambiguous language that would leave no room for misunderstanding that the dance was restricted to white personnel only. Black soldiers were informed through their chain of command that a separate dance would be organized for them at a later date and in a different location, following the standard policy of separate but theoretically equal facilities. This was entirely standard procedure, according to United States Army regulations, that had been in place since the military's earliest days and had been refined and formalized over decades of practice. The Special Services officers who drafted the announcement gave it no more thought than they gave to any other routine administrative task. What the organizers utterly failed to consider, operating as they were within the bubble of American military culture and assumptions, was that the British women who were expected to attend might have their own very strong opinions on the matter, and that they might not feel any obligation whatsoever to respect or participate in American racial policies. Mary Walsh, a 19-year-old who worked 10-hour shifts at a local munitions factory, assembling components for artillery shells, her hands perpetually stained with metal residue, and her hair covered during work hours with the required safety scarf, learned about the restriction from her younger brother William, who worked as a civilian laborer at the American base, performing maintenance and supply work, that freed military personnel for other duties. William, who was 16 and too young for military service, but desperate to contribute to the war effort in any way possible, came home on the evening of September 13th and mentioned casually over the sparse dinner their mother had prepared from carefully rationed ingredients that there would be a dance at the parish hall the following night, but that the nice American soldiers who had helped him fix his bicycle and always shared their candy rations would not be allowed to attend. Mary felt immediate and visceral anger rise in her chest, a physical sensation of outrage that surprised her with its intensity. These black soldiers, these men whom official propaganda from both the American and British governments proclaimed were fighting for freedom and democracy and human dignity. These men who were risking their lives as part of the Great Alliance against tyranny and oppression were being told they were not good enough to attend a simple village dance. The contradiction was too glaring, too offensive to basic fairness, too obviously wrong to simply accept without response. Walsh was not alone in her reaction, and the news spread through the informal networks of young women in Bamber Bridge, with the speed that important gossip always travels in small communities. Margaret Ainsworth, a 21-year-old nurse who worked at the local hospital, treating wounded soldiers evacuated from various fronts, who had held the hands of suffering men from multiple nations and learned that courage looked exactly the same, regardless of skin color or nationality, found the policy utterly incomprehensible. She had treated American soldiers, both white and black, and had seen no relevant difference in their pain or their gratitude for medical care. The idea that these men should be separated for social purposes while being treated together in medical wards struck her as not merely wrong, but actively incoherent. Dorothy Clark, a teacher's assistant at the village school who had grown up in Bamber Bridge and knew virtually everyone in the community by name and family connection, considered the exclusion policy an insult to basic decency and an affront to the values of fairness and kindness that she tried to instill in her students every day. She had watched black American soldiers interact with village children, always patient and friendly, often sharing sweets from their rations and telling stories about America that fascinated the children. The thought of excluding such men from community events seemed not just unfair but cruel, a betrayal of the hospitality that she had been taught was a moral obligation. Across Bamber Bridge, in kitchens and shop floors and hospital corridors, the women who had been looking forward to the dance began to talk among themselves, their conversations marked by a growing sense of indignation and moral clarity. They discussed what they had observed of the black soldiers over the months since their arrival, how they had always been respectful and courteous, often more so than some of the white American soldiers, who could be loud and presumptuous. How they had helped elderly residents carry heavy packages, fixed broken equipment with mechanical skills honed in pre-war jobs, played with local children with gentle patience. How they had seemed genuinely grateful for small kindnesses that white civilians apparently took for granted. The women talked about their own men who were serving overseas, facing dangers and hardships in places far from home, relying on the kindness of strangers in foreign lands. They talked about what it must feel like to be so far from home, fighting in a war that was not being fought on your own soil, being treated as somehow less worthy than soldiers from your own country. They talked about the propaganda that urged everyone to stand together against tyranny and oppression, and how hollow those words seemed when applied selectively based on skin color. The British popular press, operating under wartime censorship that limited what could be published, but did not entirely muzzle criticism of Allied policies, had been running stories about American racial policies with a mixture of confusion and thinly veiled criticism. The average British citizen, while certainly not free from prejudice or class consciousness or various forms of social discrimination, could not understand the American system of segregation with its elaborate rules and its obsessive concern with preventing any social contact between racial groups. Britain had its own rigid class divisions, certainly, divisions that affected everything from education to employment to marriage prospects. But those divisions were based on economics and family background and accent rather than skin color, and they were maintained through social pressure and economic reality rather than through formal legal prohibition. The idea that a man could be barred from a public space, prevented from eating at a lunch counter, forced to use separate facilities, simply because of his ancestry and skin color, struck many British people as not just morally wrong, but genuinely bizarre, a throwback to earlier centuries, rather than a policy fit for a modern democratic nation. The contrast between American claims to be fighting for freedom and democracy and American maintenance of rigid racial segregation had not escaped notice, and it created a growing undercurrent of criticism that the American military command found increasingly difficult to manage or dismiss. On the afternoon of September 14th, as the September sun slanted through the windows of her family's modest row house, Mary Walsh made a decision that would echo far beyond that single afternoon. She contacted her friends through the informal network of personal visits and telephone calls that connected the young women of the village, and she proposed a plan that was both elegantly simple and quietly revolutionary. If the dance was to be restricted to white soldiers only, excluding the black soldiers who had become familiar and valued members of the community, then they would not attend. Not one of them. They would show the American military command exactly what they thought of such policies, through the most powerful tool available to them as civilians in a democratic society: collective refusal to participate. The idea spread through the young women of Bamber Bridge with remarkable speed, passed along through conversations at work, through chance meetings on the street, through messages delivered by younger siblings and friends. By early evening, as the sun began to set and the time for the dance approached, virtually every woman who had planned to attend had agreed to the boycott. They made their decision not out of political ideology or organized activism, but out of a simple sense that participating in the dance would make them complicit in something fundamentally unfair, and they were not willing to accept that complicity. They gathered in small groups at various locations around the village, carefully dressed in their finest clothes, as if ready for the dance they were refusing to attend, making their presence and their decision visible to anyone who cared to observe. They wore their best dresses, many of them carefully preserved from before the war, or painstakingly made from whatever fabric could be obtained through ration coupons and creative resourcefulness. They had done their hair, applied the small amounts of makeup they could acquire, prepared themselves as they would for any important social occasion. But instead of going to the parish hall, they waited in small clusters, talking quietly among themselves, their very visible absence making a statement more powerful than any written protest could have achieved. At the parish hall, the scene that unfolded was one of growing confusion and embarrassment for the American military organizers. The band had set up their equipment on the small stage at one end of the hall, running through their repertoire of popular songs and swing music that American servicemen requested at every dance. The American military police had arrived early to provide security and ensure order, positioning themselves at entrances and exits, with the professional bearing of men accustomed to managing large crowds. The white soldiers from units stationed around Lancashire, scrubbed and polished in their dress uniforms, hair carefully combed and shoes meticulously shined, began arriving in groups just as the sun set, excited for an evening of music and dancing and the brief escape from military routine that such events provided. What they found was a hall that had been elaborately decorated for a dance, with bunting and streamers carefully arranged, with refreshment tables set up and laden with whatever treats could be obtained through military supply channels and local donations. They found a band ready to play, instruments tuned and music stands arranged. They found military police standing ready to manage security. They found everything prepared for a successful social evening, except for the one absolutely essential element: women, not one. Not a single woman had entered the hall or appeared to be approaching it. The organizers checked their watches repeatedly, thinking perhaps there had been some misunderstanding about the start time, though the notices had been quite clear, and previous dances had always seen women arriving eagerly and early. 15 minutes passed with no arrivals, then 30 minutes, then 45. Still no women appeared. Confused soldiers stood in small clusters throughout the hall, talking among themselves with increasing bewilderment, trying to understand what had gone wrong, wondering if perhaps there had been some emergency in the village that had prevented the women from attending. Lieutenant Colonel James Caldwell, the senior American officer present and the man ultimately responsible for the organization of recreational activities in the region, demanded an explanation from his subordinates with the kind of barely controlled anger that comes from public embarrassment and the awareness that something has gone seriously wrong with carefully laid plans. His face, according to multiple witnesses who recounted the scene in letters and later interviews, progressed through several distinct shades of red as the situation became clear. The local British liaison officer, a reserved man in his late 50s named Arthur Pemberton, who had served in the previous war and lost a son at Dunkirk, delivered the news with what might have been the faintest hint of satisfaction visible in the corners of his mouth. The women of Bamber Bridge, Pemberton informed the increasingly angry colonel in his calm Lancashire accent, had declined to attend the dance because they would not participate in an event that excluded the black soldiers they had come to know and respect as valued members of their community. They had made their decision collectively, and they were quite firm in it. Unless the policy changed and all American soldiers were welcome, there would be no dance, tonight or any other night. The women had spoken, and in democratic Britain, women had the right to make such choices about their own participation in social events. The colonel's face, according to witnesses, went through an impressive range of expressions as he processed this information: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, a kind of frustrated recognition that this was not a problem that military hierarchy or command authority could solve in any straightforward way. You could order soldiers to follow regulations, to perform assigned tasks, to maintain discipline. You could threaten punishment for disobedience and enforce compliance through the powerful machinery of military justice. But you could not order civilians in a foreign country to comply with your social preferences, particularly when those civilians were the very people your military forces were supposedly defending, and when offending them would create the kind of diplomatic incident that would reflect badly all the way up the chain of command to the highest levels of American and British military cooperation. Private Harold Walker, a white soldier from rural Georgia who had been looking forward to the dance for weeks as a break from the tedious routine of military life, stood in the empty hall feeling a complex mixture of disappointment and embarrassment and slowly growing awareness. He had never questioned segregation in his life, had grown up accepting it as natural and proper, as simply the way things were and should be. Standing in that elaborately decorated but completely empty hall, however, forced him to confront the reality that others saw the situation very differently. He later wrote to his sister back in Georgia, in a letter that she preserved for decades, that it was the first time he had been forced to confront the possibility that the segregation he considered normal might actually be something shameful, something that decent people would refuse to participate in, rather than accept as inevitable. The silence of that empty dance hall, Walker wrote, was louder and more effective than any lecture or sermon could have been. The careful decorations, the ready band, the prepared refreshments, all mocked the men who stood there in their dress uniforms with no one to dance with, made visible the cost of policies they had never thought to question. Some of the soldiers made jokes to cover their embarrassment, but the jokes fell flat in the echoing space. Others simply stood in uncomfortable silence, aware that something significant was happening, but not entirely sure how to process it or what it meant. Outside the hall, in the soft September evening air that carried the smell of coal smoke from household fires and the distant sound of factory machinery running night shifts for war production, the women of Bamber Bridge maintained their quiet but visible protest. They had not come to shout or confront anyone directly, had not organized picket lines or made speeches. They simply refused to participate in discrimination, made their refusal visible, and let that refusal speak for itself. Mary Walsh later recalled in interviews, given decades after the event, that they felt nervous but determined, aware that they were challenging a powerful institution but confident in the rightness of their cause. They were standing up for men who had shown them nothing but courtesy and respect, men who were far from home fighting in a war that affected them all, men who deserved to be treated with the same dignity accorded to any other soldiers. It was not a complicated political position or a sophisticated ideological stance. It was simple human decency expressed through collective action, the kind of moral clarity that comes from direct personal experience rather than abstract principle. Word of the boycott spread through the American military installations scattered across Lancashire, with the remarkable speed that significant news always travels in close-knit military communities. Black soldiers, hearing what had happened through the informal networks that connected enlisted men across all barriers of official separation, reacted with a mixture of disbelief, profound gratitude, and emotional overwhelm that many found difficult to express or even fully understand. These were men who had spent their entire lives being told, both explicitly and implicitly, through 1,000 daily interactions and restrictions, that they were inferior, that their presence was unwelcome in white spaces, that they should accept their subordinate status as natural and inevitable, and any challenge to that status would be met with swift and potentially violent response. Sergeant Robert Matthews, who had survived 3 decades of Jim Crow in rural Alabama and 6 years of military segregation, found himself unable to speak for several minutes when he heard the news, his throat tight with emotions he had learned long ago to suppress as dangerous. He had grown so accustomed to degradation, to casual insults and systematic exclusion, that kindness and solidarity from white civilians seemed almost impossible to process. The idea that someone had stood up for him, had sacrificed their own enjoyment to protest his exclusion, challenged assumptions so fundamental to his understanding of how the world worked that it required a complete recalibration of his thinking. Corporal Thomas Henderson, ever the meticulous documentarian, recorded in his careful notes that grown men, tough veterans who had learned through hard experience to show no emotion in the face of daily humiliation, to accept whatever indignities were inflicted with stoic silence, wept openly at the simple fact that someone had stood up for them, not out of pity or condescension, not out of political calculation or ideological commitment, but out of basic human recognition that they deserved the same dignity and respect as anyone else, that their exclusion was wrong and should not be tolerated by decent people. Private James Wilson, sitting in his barracks that evening and hearing the story repeated by one man after another as the news spread, felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what was possible in human relations. For his entire life, he had been taught to lower his expectations, to accept that white people would always see him as inferior, that the best he could hope for was to be left alone and avoid the worst excesses of discrimination. The women of Bamber Bridge had demonstrated that this was not an immutable law of nature, but a choice that people made, and that when people chose differently, the entire structure of segregation could be challenged and even defeated. The immediate aftermath of the boycott created a genuine crisis for the American military command that went beyond simple embarrassment to threaten carefully constructed policies and procedures. They could not allow the situation to stand without some kind of response, as that would signal weakness and potentially encourage similar challenges to segregation policies throughout the European theatre of operations. But any response carried significant risks that had to be carefully weighed against potential benefits. If they tried to punish the women of Bamber Bridge in any way, they would create a major international incident that would reflect badly on the United States, at a time when Allied cooperation was absolutely essential to military success, and when American diplomats were working hard to maintain British public support for the American war effort. If they tried to pressure British civilian authorities to enforce American racial policies, they would be told politely but firmly that Britain had its own laws and customs and would not adopt American segregation. If they did nothing and simply accepted the boycott, they would appear weak and powerless, and white soldiers and officers who supported segregation would see it as a dangerous precedent that might encourage further challenges to racial policies they considered essential to military order and discipline. The solution, arrived at after hurried consultations up and down the chain of command and urgent communications with higher military authorities, came not from any brilliant strategic thinking, but from the simple pressure of social reality and practical necessity. The scheduled dance had been a complete and highly visible failure, an embarrassment that reflected badly on everyone involved in its organization. The band had packed up their instruments after playing a desultory hour of music to an audience of confused and disappointed soldiers. The refreshments had gone largely untouched, though some soldiers had helped themselves to sandwiches and punched more out of boredom than hunger. The decorations hung limply in the empty hall like symbols of failed policy. The entire event had become a powerful demonstration that segregation could not be maintained without the active cooperation of the people it sought to control, and that when people decided collectively not to cooperate, all the military authority and bureaucratic procedures in the world could not force compliance. You could order soldiers to follow regulations. You could not order free civilians in an allied democratic nation to participate in policies they found morally objectionable. Within 72 hours, after intense internal debates and careful drafting of language that would allow all parties to save face to whatever degree possible, the American military authorities quietly announced a new policy for recreational events in the Bamber Bridge area, and eventually for much of the Lancashire region. Dances and other social activities would be open to all American personnel, regardless of color or unit assignment. The announcement was carefully framed as an administrative adjustment made to better accommodate the unique circumstances of service in Britain, rather than as a policy reversal forced by civilian protest, allowing the command structure to maintain at least the appearance of having made a deliberate choice, rather than having been forced into a humiliating retreat. The first officially integrated dance was held 2 weeks later, on the evening of September 28, 1943, in the same parish hall that had stood so embarrassingly empty on September 14th. The women of Bamber Bridge attended in force, filling the hall with the laughter and energy that had been so conspicuously absent from the previous attempt. Mary Walsh danced with both white and black soldiers that evening, as did virtually everyone else present, moving easily from one partner to another without any of the apocalyptic social breakdown that segregationists constantly predicted would result from racial mixing. The evening was, by all accounts gathered from letters and later interviews, completely unremarkable in the best possible way, which was precisely the point that the women of Bamber Bridge had been trying to make. When people were allowed to simply be people, to interact as individuals rather than as representatives of racial categories, to dance and laugh and enjoy music together, nothing terrible happened. The sky did not fall, social order did not collapse. Young people simply enjoyed an evening of entertainment together, creating memories and friendships that many would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Private James Wilson described that evening years later as one of the most important of his entire life. Important not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing dramatic happened. He danced with British women who treated him like a normal human being, who laughed at his jokes and complimented his dancing, and asked him about his home and his family with genuine interest rather than condescension or curiosity about exotic specimens. He talked with white soldiers who, removed from the rigid context of enforced segregation and official racial hierarchy, proved capable of basic civility and even friendliness, able to share a conversation about music or sports or complaints about military food without the tension and hostility that segregation created. He experienced, for one evening and then for other evenings that followed as the new policy took hold, what life might be like in a world where his skin color did not determine every interaction, did not serve as a barrier to ordinary human connection, did not mark him as fundamentally different and inferior. It was a glimpse of possibility that he would carry with him through the rest of the war and into the decades of civil rights struggle that would follow. Proof that segregation was not natural or inevitable, but rather a choice that could be challenged and changed. The impact of the Bamber Bridge boycott extended far beyond that one small Lancashire village and its relatively brief moment of moral courage. Word spread through the black soldiers serving throughout Britain, carried by letters written home and then shared with other units by conversations during the movements of troops and supplies, by the simple fact that men could hardly believe what they were hearing and wanted to confirm it through multiple sources. British civilians, in a small working-class village most Americans had never heard of, had stood up for black soldiers in a way that most white Americans had never done, had risked social conflict and disappointed their own expectations of entertainment to protest racial exclusion. This had profound and lasting psychological effects on the men who heard about it or experienced it directly. Technical Sergeant Robert Matthews later wrote in letters that were preserved by his family that Bamber Bridge fundamentally changed his understanding of what was possible in human relations. For years, through his childhood in Alabama and his adult life in the segregated military, he had been told constantly through both explicit statements and implicit daily interactions that segregation was natural, inevitable, simply the way things had to be because of fundamental differences between races that made equality impossible and undesirable. The boycott demonstrated with undeniable clarity that this was a lie, a social construction rather than a natural law. When people chose to reject segregation, when they refused to participate in racial exclusion, the entire structure collapsed because it had no foundation beyond the willingness of people to enforce it. It existed only through collective agreement to maintain it, and when that agreement was withdrawn, it became powerless. The women of Bamber Bridge, with no weapons except their collective refusal to participate in injustice, had defeated military policy and forced institutional change. The story also spread through the white military units stationed in Britain, though it was received very differently there depending on individual attitudes and regional backgrounds. Some white soldiers felt genuine shame at what had happened, a dawning awareness that the segregation they had accepted without question might actually be morally wrong and worthy of opposition. Others reacted with anger and resentment, feeling that the British had betrayed American soldiers by refusing to respect American racial customs, by choosing to side with black soldiers over white soldiers in matters of social organization. Still others simply felt confused, unable to reconcile their deeply ingrained understanding of racial hierarchy with the clear message that the women of Bamber Bridge had sent, struggling to process the cognitive dissonance between believing in segregation and witnessing its rejection by people whose opinions they had been taught to value. The incident created conversations and debates within white units that might never have occurred otherwise, forcing at least some soldiers to articulate and examine assumptions they had never questioned. The American military command made efforts to suppress discussion of the incident, fearing that it would undermine morale and discipline, would encourage further challenges to segregation policies that they still considered essential to military effectiveness, would create tensions between white and black soldiers that might affect combat readiness. But information flowed too freely in wartime Britain, particularly in the relatively open environment where soldiers interacted regularly with British civilians and where military censorship focused primarily on operational security rather than social issues. Letters went home describing what had happened. Soldiers talked in pubs and at dances and during work details. The story took on a life of its own, growing and spreading beyond any ability of official channels to contain it. British newspapers picked up the story in the weeks following the boycott, though coverage was limited by wartime censorship guidelines that restricted what could be published about military matters and Allied relations. The articles that did appear treated the incident as an example of British working-class decency and common sense standing up to foreign prejudice, though the language used was carefully diplomatic to avoid creating unnecessary friction with the American allies whose military and industrial might was essential to winning the war. Editorial writers praised the women of Bamber Bridge for their moral courage, while carefully avoiding direct criticism of overall American military policy, walking the delicate line between supporting their own citizens and maintaining crucial diplomatic relations. The coverage, though modest in scope and carefully worded, was enough to ensure that the story entered British public consciousness and contributed to growing British unease with American racial policies. Working-class readers across Britain, reading about women in a Lancashire village who could have been their own sisters or daughters, felt a sense of pride in the decision to boycott the segregated dance. Middle-class and upper-class readers, many of whom harbored their own prejudices and were hardly free from discriminatory attitudes, nevertheless found themselves forced to confront the contradiction between fighting for freedom abroad while accepting discrimination at home. The incident also caught the attention of members of Parliament who had been monitoring the social effects of the large American military presence in Britain. Several members raised questions in Parliament about whether British civilians were being pressured to participate in enforcing American segregation policies and whether the government was doing enough to ensure that American forces respected British social norms while operating on British soil. The questions were handled carefully by government ministers who were well aware of the diplomatic sensitivities involved, but the mere fact that they were raised publicly put additional pressure on American military commanders to moderate their approach to racial policies in Britain. For the black soldiers of the 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, the months following the Bamber Bridge boycott brought both continued challenges and occasional moments of hope that suggested change might be possible. They continued to face segregation in military facilities, continued to deal with white military police who enforced racial hierarchies, continued to navigate the complex and often contradictory rules that governed their lives as black servicemen in a segregated military. But they also experienced continued acceptance and friendship from British civilians who judged them as individuals rather than as members of a racial category. Private Wilson began attending Sunday services at a local church, where the congregation welcomed him warmly, and the vicar, an elderly man who had lost 2 sons in the previous war, went out of his way to make American soldiers of all backgrounds feel at home in his parish. Wilson found solace in those quiet Sunday mornings, sitting in pews that had been occupied by generations of Lancashire working people, singing hymns with British voices around him, experiencing a brief respite from the racial tensions that dominated military life. He formed friendships with British families who invited him to Sunday dinners, sharing their rationed food with generous hospitality and asking about his life in America, with genuine curiosity rather than the voyeuristic fascination that sometimes characterized white American interest in black life. Technical Sergeant Matthews began a correspondence with a British family whose son was serving in North Africa. The family had met Matthews when he helped their elderly father repair a broken fence, refusing payment, but accepting an invitation to tea. The mother wrote to Matthews regularly, including him in the family letters that went to their serving son, treating him as an adopted member of the family. Matthews kept those letters for the rest of his life, carefully preserved through years of moving and changing circumstances, treasured proof that it was possible to be seen and valued as a complete human being rather than reduced to a racial category. Corporal Henderson continued his meticulous documentation of life as a black soldier in wartime Britain, filling notebook after notebook with observations about the contradictions and occasional moments of grace that characterized the experience. He recorded conversations with British civilians who expressed genuine bewilderment at American racial policies, asking questions that revealed how arbitrary and irrational segregation appeared to people approaching it from outside American cultural assumptions. He noted the gradual changes in behavior among some white American soldiers who, exposed to British attitudes and forced to confront the emptiness of segregated social events, began to question beliefs they had never examined. He documented the ongoing tensions and occasional confrontations between black soldiers and white military police, the ways that segregation was maintained even when official policies changed, the creative methods that commanders used to keep racial groups separated while technically complying with new regulations. But he also documented moments of solidarity and friendship across racial lines, instances where white and black soldiers worked together effectively and even formed genuine bonds when circumstances allowed it, evidence that segregation was not necessary for military effectiveness, but rather an obstacle to it. The women of Bamber Bridge who had organized and participated in the boycott continued with their lives, returning to factory work and nursing and teaching and the countless other roles that women filled in the wartime economy. They did not seek recognition or fame for their action, did not form organizations to promote their cause, did not attempt to replicate their boycott in other circumstances. For them, it had been a simple matter of doing what seemed right in the moment, of refusing to participate in something they recognized as wrong, of standing with people who had shown them courtesy and respect. But the experience changed them in subtle ways that affected their subsequent choices and attitudes. Mary Walsh found that she had developed a confidence that carried through into other areas of her life. If she could stand up to the American military command over a matter of principle, if she could organize collective action that successfully challenged institutional policy, then she could face other challenges with similar courage. She became more willing to speak up when she saw injustice, more confident in her own moral judgments, more certain that ordinary people could make a difference when they acted together. Margaret Ainsworth carried the experience into her nursing career, becoming even more committed to treating all patients with equal dignity and care, regardless of their background or circumstances. She had seen how arbitrary discrimination could be, how it could be challenged and overcome by simple refusal to participate, and she applied those lessons throughout her professional life. When she later worked in hospitals that attempted to maintain discriminatory practices in treatment or assignment of patients, she quietly resisted, using her position and her professional authority to ensure that all patients received the same quality of care. Dorothy Clark incorporated the lessons of the boycott into her teaching, emphasizing to her students the importance of standing up for fairness and treating all people with dignity. She used age-appropriate language and examples, but she made sure that the children in her care understood that prejudice was not inevitable or natural, that people could choose to behave differently. That moral courage sometimes meant refusing to go along with what everyone else was doing. Many of her students remembered those lessons decades later, carrying them into their own adult lives and decisions. The parish hall continued to host dances throughout the war years and beyond, becoming a place where British civilians and American soldiers of all backgrounds mixed freely in the social atmosphere that the women's boycott had helped to create. The integrated dances became a regular feature of Bamber Bridge life, so normal and unremarkable that eventually people forgot there had ever been an attempt to segregate them. Young people danced and laughed and formed friendships, and occasionally romances, without any of the social catastrophe that segregationists had predicted would result from racial mixing. The normalization of integration in social settings had ripple effects beyond the dance hall. Black soldiers felt more comfortable moving through the village, shopping in local stores, chatting with civilians on the street, participating in community life, without the constant anxiety about whether their presence would cause problems. British civilians grew accustomed to seeing American soldiers of different backgrounds mixing naturally, which reinforced their sense that American segregation policies were arbitrary and unnecessary rather than reflecting some natural order. White American soldiers, particularly younger men, who had grown up with segregation but had not yet fully internalized all its assumptions and justifications, found themselves questioning beliefs they had inherited. When they saw black soldiers and white soldiers and British civilians all interacting normally at dances and in pubs and on the streets, when they experienced directly that nothing terrible happened from such mixing, it became harder to maintain the fiction that segregation was necessary for social order. Some of these soldiers carried those questions home with them after the war, contributing to the slow erosion of support for segregation among younger white Americans. The broader context of the war itself created additional pressure on segregation policies. The United States was fighting, officially and explicitly, against fascist regimes that promoted theories of racial superiority and practiced systematic discrimination and violence against groups deemed inferior. American propaganda emphasized themes of freedom, democracy, equality, and human dignity. President Franklin Roosevelt spoke eloquently about the four freedoms, including freedom from fear and freedom from want, as universal human rights that the war was being fought to secure. The contradiction between this rhetoric and the reality of segregation in the American military became increasingly difficult to ignore or explain away. How could the United States credibly claim to be fighting for freedom and equality while maintaining rigid racial hierarchies in its own armed forces? How could American leaders condemn fascist racial theories while enforcing segregation based on equally arbitrary racial categories? These questions were being asked not just by Black Americans and their allies, but by international observers and by thoughtful people within the American military establishment itself. Some senior American military commanders recognized that segregation was becoming a liability, undermining American moral authority and creating practical problems in coalition warfare. When American forces worked alongside British units or forces from other allied nations that did not practice segregation, the contrast became embarrassingly obvious. When American propaganda films showed integrated units fighting together for freedom while actual American units remained rigidly segregated, the hypocrisy was too blatant to miss. When Black soldiers demonstrated courage and competence in combat while still being denied opportunities available to white soldiers, the claimed justifications for segregation based on inferior ability or reliability were exposed as lies. But change came slowly because segregation had powerful defenders who believed genuinely that it was necessary and right, and who had institutional power to resist reform. Southern politicians who controlled key congressional committees threatened to block military appropriations if segregation was challenged. Senior military officers who had spent their entire careers in a segregated military saw integration as a dangerous experiment that might undermine discipline and cohesion. White soldiers from segregated communities resisted integration because it challenged their sense of racial superiority and social status. The combination of ideological commitment, institutional inertia, and political calculation meant that segregation persisted despite its obvious contradictions with American war aims. The Bamber Bridge incident represented one small crack in this structure, one moment when the contradictions became too obvious to ignore, and the local authorities were forced to change policy despite their preferences. It did not lead immediately to broader military desegregation or to any comprehensive reform of American racial policies. But it was part of a larger pattern of challenges and contradictions that gradually weakened the foundations of segregation and made eventual change possible. For the historians and sociologists who later studied this period, Bamber Bridge offered important insights into how social change happens and how ordinary people can challenge institutional injustice. The boycott demonstrated that significant change does not always require violence or dramatic confrontation, that sometimes the most effective resistance is simply refusing to participate in unjust systems. The women who stayed away from the dance did not attack anyone, did not destroy property, did not engage in any form of aggression. They simply withdrew their cooperation, and that withdrawal was enough to force institutional change. The incident also demonstrated the importance of solidarity across lines of difference. The women of Bamber Bridge had no personal stake in American racial politics, gained nothing material from their boycott, and could have enjoyed the dance while telling themselves that American segregation was not their concern. Instead, they chose to stand with Black soldiers because they recognized that the exclusion was wrong and that participating in it would make them complicit. This kind of solidarity, rooted in moral conviction rather than self-interest or shared identity, proved remarkably powerful in challenging injustice. The story illustrated how local actions could have broader significance even when they did not lead to immediate systemic change. The women of Bamber Bridge did not end segregation in the American military. They did not force any comprehensive policy reform, but they demonstrated that segregation could be successfully challenged, that it required active cooperation to maintain, and that when people refused that cooperation, it collapsed. They provided proof of concept that ordinary people could successfully resist institutional racism, and that proof inspired and encouraged others who faced similar injustices. The incident also revealed how cultural context shapes both the implementation and the challenge of discriminatory policies. American segregation could not be fully enforced in Britain because British cultural attitudes and social norms did not support it. British civilians did not share American racial assumptions, did not understand the elaborate machinery of segregation, and saw no reason to participate in importing foreign prejudices. This cultural difference created space for resistance and alternative possibilities that would have been much more difficult to achieve in the United States itself. The personal relationships that developed between Black American soldiers and British civilians during the war years had lasting effects that extended well beyond the immediate wartime context. Several hundred Black American servicemen married British women during and after the war, settling in Britain and creating families that navigated complex questions of identity and belonging. These families faced their own challenges, as Britain was hardly free from racism, and the children of mixed relationships often struggled with questions of acceptance and identity. But they also represented concrete examples of human connection across racial and national boundaries, living proof that segregation was not natural or inevitable. Many Black soldiers who served in Britain maintained connections with British friends and families for years or even decades after the war, exchanging letters and occasionally visits, keeping alive memories of a time when they had experienced glimpses of what life might be like without the constant burden of American racial discrimination. These connections provided emotional sustenance during the difficult years of the 1950s and 60s, when the civil rights movement challenged segregation in the face of massive resistance and often violent opposition. The memory of Bamber Bridge and other moments of British acceptance served as proof that another world was possible, that segregation was a choice rather than a necessity, that people could choose to behave differently. The veterans of the 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion carried their wartime experiences into their post-war lives in complex ways. They returned to an America that was still deeply segregated, where the promises of equal treatment and dignity that they had glimpsed in Britain remained largely unfulfilled. Many struggled with the transition back to Jim Crow after experiencing, even briefly and imperfectly, what it felt like to be treated as equal human beings. The contrast between British acceptance and American discrimination was psychologically difficult, creating both hope that change was possible and frustration that it remained so distant. Private James Wilson returned to Chicago after the war and became involved in local civil rights organizing through his church and community groups. He worked on voter registration drives, participated in protests against discriminatory housing policies, and told the story of Bamber Bridge frequently as an example of what ordinary people could accomplish through collective action and moral courage. He emphasized that the women who boycotted the dance were not professional activists or trained organizers, just ordinary young women who saw something wrong and decided not to participate in it. If they could successfully challenge the American military, he argued, then Black Americans and their allies could successfully challenge segregation at home. Technical Sergeant Robert Matthews remained in the military after the war, benefiting from the military desegregation order that President Harry Truman issued in 1948. He served in integrated units during the Korean conflict and eventually reached the rank of Master Sergeant before retiring in 1962. He experienced directly the transformation of the American military from a rigidly segregated institution to one that, however imperfectly, attempted to provide equal opportunity regardless of race. He later credited his time in Britain, and particularly the Bamber Bridge incident, with helping him believe that such change was possible and worth fighting for. Corporal Thomas Henderson used his extensive notes and observations as the foundation for a memoir that he wrote in the 1970s, when interest in the African-American experience during the Second World War was growing as part of broader reassessment of American history. His detailed documentation of daily life as a Black soldier, including the Bamber Bridge incident, provided invaluable first-hand testimony that helped historians understand the realities of segregation in the military and the various forms of resistance to it. The memoir found a modest but appreciative audience, particularly among scholars and students interested in the intersection of military history, civil rights history, and the African-American experience. Mary Walsh lived a long life in Lancashire, marrying a British veteran who had served in Italy, raising 3 children, and working various jobs as the British economy recovered and transformed in the post-war decades. She rarely spoke publicly about the boycott, still viewing it as simply something that needed to be done, rather than anything particularly heroic or historically significant. When local historians contacted her in the 1980s, interested in documenting the incident, she was initially puzzled by their interest. "We just thought it was the right thing to do," she said in one recorded interview. "Those soldiers were fighting in the war same as anyone else. They deserved better than to be shut out of a dance." But she acknowledged that participating in the boycott had given her confidence that carried through the rest of her life, a sense that ordinary people could make a difference when they stood together on matters of principle. She had raised her children with those values, emphasizing the importance of fairness and standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. Several of her grandchildren became involved in various social justice causes in their own adult lives, carrying forward a family tradition of moral engagement that had roots in that September evening in 1943. The parish hall where the dance had been scheduled continued to serve the Bamber Bridge community for many decades after the war, hosting countless dances, wedding receptions, community meetings and social gatherings. The building was eventually renovated and expanded, modernized to meet changing needs and expectations. In the late 1990s, when the community became more aware of the historical significance of the boycott, through the efforts of local historians and the growing academic interest in the African American experience in wartime Britain, a commemorative plaque was installed at the hall describing what had happened there in September 1943. The plaque attracted visitors from Britain and America, including veterans of the 823rd Engineer Aviation Battalion, who made pilgrimages to Bamber Bridge in their later years to see again the place where they had experienced unexpected solidarity and kindness. These visits were often emotional affairs, elderly men returning to streets that had changed dramatically over the decades, but that still carried memories of a time when they had been young and far from home and had found acceptance in an unexpected place. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.